Chapter 1. It was on a bleak autumn morning in 1895 that I found myself once more in the familiar sitting room of 221B Baker Street, a newspaper in my hands and my friend Sherlock Holmes seated opposite me in his customary fashion. Long limbs sprawled across the armchair, fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin. Outside, a thick London fog clung to the streets, muffling the sounds of hooves and hurried footfalls. Holmes had spent the morning in silence, his piercing grey eyes staring vacantly at the ceiling, an unlit pipe resting between his fingers. I knew better than to interrupt him when he fell into these meditative states, for they often preceded the unravelling of some intricate puzzle. At last he stirred. "Watson, your choice of reading material suggests a desperate search for intrigue, where there is none." His voice was crisp with amusement. I lowered my copy of the Times and frowned. "And what, pray, is my choice of reading material?" "The obituary section, of course." Holmes sat up, reaching for his own newspaper. A man who reads the news for politics or sport holds the paper aloft, shifting its weight between pages. A man who studies the obituaries, however, lets the paper rest, as you have done, with a certain solemnity. Now tell me, was it a friend, a former patient, or simply morbid curiosity? I chuckled despite myself. "Merely curiosity, Holmes." A rather strange entry caught my attention. Holmes's interest sharpened instantly. "Strange, you say?" I turned the page and pointed to a brief notice. "Mrs. Eleanor Gray, widow of the late Mr. Archibald Gray, has tragically passed away. Her sudden death comes as a great shock, given that she was reported missing just 1 week prior. Funeral services will be held in Kensington." Holmes read the passage swiftly and then leaned back in his chair. "A widow who disappears, and then, upon being found, promptly dies. Most irregular. Indeed, Scotland Yard was unable to locate her for an entire week. She vanished without a trace, only to reappear as a corpse. Surely you find that peculiar." Holmes drummed his fingers against the armrest. "Curious, Watson, but not yet a mystery. If we were to investigate every suspicious death in London, we should be occupied for a lifetime. However, let us apply logic before leaping to intrigue. You say she was a widow. Yes. Her husband passed away 3 months ago, leaving her a sizable estate." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A vanished widow with an inheritance. Now that is a more promising angle." At that moment, Mrs. Hudson's voice interrupted our musings as she announced a visitor. A frail gentleman entered, his gait unsteady, his lined face a mask of distress. He removed his hat, twisting it in nervous hands. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice quivering, "I am Arthur Gray, the nephew of the late Mrs. Eleanor Gray. I beg for your help. Something terrible has happened." Holmes sat forward, his gaze sharpening. "Pray, Mr. Gray, enlighten us. What exactly has happened to your aunt?" The man swallowed hard. "She is alive." A silence fell upon the room, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. I looked to Holmes, expecting surprise, but instead he smiled, a thin, knowing smile that told me the game was afoot. Chapter 2. Arthur Gray's trembling fingers clutched the brim of his hat as he sat before us, his ashen face betraying a mixture of relief and terror. Holmes studied him with that keen, hawk-like gaze of his, but said nothing, allowing the man to compose himself. "You must understand," Gray stammered, his voice dry as old parchment. I attended my aunt's funeral just yesterday. I saw the coffin lowered into the ground. And yet, this morning, I received a letter. From her. Holmes steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. A rather inconvenient turn of events. For the undertaker, I should think, he murmured. Tell me, Mr. Gray, do you have this letter with you? Yes, of course. Gray fumbled in his coat pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of ivory paper, slightly crumpled at the edges. Holmes took it delicately, examining the texture and watermark, before reading the hurried, uneven script aloud. Arthur, I am in terrible danger. Do not believe what they tell you. I cannot trust anyone. Meet me at midnight near the old glass house in Kew Gardens. Come alone. Eleanor Watson and I exchanged bewildered glances, but Holmes merely tapped the paper against his knee, his expression thoughtful. Interesting, he mused. There is a tremor in the handwriting, suggesting distress, but not necessarily age. The ink is fresh, which means the letter was written no more than a day ago. Tell me, Mr. Gray, who declared your aunt dead? Physician Dr. Edwin Talbot, Gray replied. He attended her in her final days, at least so we thought. My aunt had vanished a week before her supposed death. When her body was discovered in her home, Dr. Talbot confirmed her passing. There was no doubt. Holmes nodded, his mind working at a furious pace. And this body, was it seen by anyone else? Scotland Yard, perhaps? Gray hesitated. Only by the doctor and her solicitor, Mr. Hargreaves. The funeral was a closed casket, as the doctor advised it was best not to disturb the dead. Holmes's lips twitched in amusement. Ah, the convenience of secrecy. I frowned. Surely, you aren't suggesting, Holmes, that an entire funeral was staged. I suggest nothing yet, my dear Watson. But we have a woman declared dead, buried, and yet alive enough to pen a letter. Either this is an elaborate hoax, or a grave injustice has been done. Gray's hands clenched. Mr. Holmes, I do not know what to believe, but I swear to you that is my aunt's handwriting. Holmes sprang to his feet with sudden energy. Then we shall believe it at least until proven otherwise. Watson, fetch your coat. Mr. Gray, you will accompany us to Kew Gardens at once. If your aunt has truly risen from the grave, I should very much like to meet her. Chapter 3. Journey to Kew Gardens was a quiet one, though the storm of uncertainty raged in Arthur Gray's anxious eyes. Holmes sat opposite us in the dim carriage, his long fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon the shifting shadows outside the rain-speckled window. It was nearly midnight when we arrived at the entrance to the gardens. A thin mist hung over the iron gates, twisting around the gas lamps like spectral fingers. The distant outline of the great glass house loomed beyond, its curved frame glistening under the moonlight. Gray's breath was shallow. She said to meet her near the glass house. Indeed, Holmes murmured. Let us proceed with caution. We stepped onto the gravel path, our footsteps muffled by the damp air. The gardens were deserted at this hour, save for the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures. Holmes led the way, his sharp gaze flitting between every shadow, every shifting leaf. As we neared the glass house, a figure emerged from the mist, a woman cloaked in a dark shawl, her posture tense as she turned towards us. Arthur! Her thin voice was barely more than a whisper. trembling yet familiar. Gray gasped. Aunt Eleanor? The woman took a hesitant step forward, and in the lantern light we saw her face, pale, gaunt, but unmistakably alive. Gray rushed to her side. But how? We buried you. The doctor, he said— I had to disappear, she interrupted, her eyes darting nervously over her shoulder. They wanted me dead. They still do. Holmes observed her keenly. Who, Mrs. Gray? She hesitated, glancing at me, then back at Holmes. I cannot say, not yet. But I know that if they discover I am alive, I shall not remain so for long. Holmes inclined his head slightly. And yet you took the risk of writing to your nephew. She swallowed. Because I have no one else to turn to. Gray grasped her hands. Aunt, tell us everything. Where have you been? Who tried to kill you? But before she could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the night. A gunshot! Eleanor gasped, clutching her side as a dark stain spread across her shawl. Watson! Holmes barked as I rushed forward, catching her before she fell. From the corner of my eye, I saw Holmes whip around, his gaze locking onto the direction of the shot. He broke into a sprint, vanishing into the fog with the hunter's speed of a man who had seen his prey. Arthur Gray knelt beside me, his face white with horror. Is she? She's alive, I said, pressing my hand against the wound. But we must get her out of here at once. Holmes would chase the shadow, but I knew this was only the beginning of the mystery. Someone had gone to great lengths to silence Eleanor Gray, and nearly succeeded. Chapter 4. I pressed my hand against Eleanor Gray's wound, feeling the warmth of her blood seeping through my fingers. Though the shot had struck her side, it had mercifully missed any vital organs. The pain, however, had rendered her barely conscious. "Stay with me, Mrs. Gray," I murmured, tearing a strip from my own coat to bind the wound. Arthur Gray hovered beside me, his hands shaking as he fumbled uselessly. She needs a doctor," he stammered. "I am a doctor," I snapped, tightening the makeshift bandage. "But I need to get her to proper care immediately." Before Gray could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps reached my ears, Holmes emerging from the fog like a spectre. He had abandoned his chase, and I could tell from the taut line of his jaw that his pursuit had been fruitless. "They were too quick," he muttered. "A professional, no doubt. The shot was meant to kill, not to warn." His keen eyes fell to Eleanor Gray. "How bad is it, Watson?" "She will live if we act fast." Holmes nodded sharply. "Then we must leave at once. This place is no longer safe." With Gray's assistance, I lifted Eleanor to her feet. She swayed but managed to lean against me as we hurried back towards the entrance of Kew Gardens. Holmes led the way, his sharp gaze flickering between the shadows, his every movement alert. As we reached the waiting carriage, Holmes spoke to the driver in a low, urgent tone. "To Baker Street, at once." The ride back was tense, filled only with Eleanor's pained breathing and Arthur's murmured reassurances. Holmes remained silent, his fingers tapping against his knee in restless thought. When we arrived at 221B, Mrs. Hudson gasped at the sight of the wounded woman, but quickly followed Holmes's instructions to prepare a room. I worked swiftly, cleaning the wound, and ensuring that no immediate danger remained. Holmes stood by the window, his arms folded. "Mrs. Gray will remain here under our protection until I deem it safe for her to leave." Arthur Gray turned to him with wide eyes. "But why, Mr. Holmes? Who would go to such lengths to kill her?" Holmes exhaled, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. "That, Mr. Gray, is precisely what I intend to find out." Just then, a soft whisper came from the bed. Eleanor Gray's eyes fluttered open. Her voice, weak but resolute. "I remember now," she murmured. "I know why they want me dead." Holmes stepped forward, his expression sharpened by anticipation. "Then, madam," he said, "I suggest you tell us everything." Chapter 5. Eleanor Gray's pale lips trembled as she fought to steady her breath. The flickering gaslight cast long shadows across the room, accentuating the fear in her eyes. Holmes stood at the foot of the bed, his sharp gaze never leaving. Her face. "Take your time, Mrs. Gray," I said gently, adjusting her pillow. "You are safe here." She swallowed hard before speaking. "I was never meant to inherit my husband's fortune." Arthur Gray stiffened. "But Uncle Archibald left everything to you in his will. It was legally binding." "Yes," she whispered, "but only because I forced his hand." A heavy silence fell over the room. Holmes, unperturbed, tilted his head slightly. "Elaborate, madam." She closed her eyes, as if bracing herself against a painful memory. Archibald Gray was not a kind man. He kept many secrets, but none more damning than the one I discovered shortly before his death. Holmes's fingers twitched. "Go on." She took a shallow breath. "He had a second wife." Arthur gasped. "That's impossible. He was married to you for 20 years. Eleanor gave a bitter smile. "And yet, years before me, he had another. A woman named Margaret Lyle. She was presumed dead, but I found evidence that suggested otherwise." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And this evidence?" "I uncovered letters, hidden correspondence between them. Letters written after she had supposedly died. Margaret Lyle was alive, Mr. Holmes, and my husband had been secretly supporting her for years." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. A fraudulent death, hidden correspondence. This case was becoming more intricate by the moment. Holmes tapped his chin. "I assume you confronted him." "I did," Eleanor admitted, "and he panicked. Within days, he rewrote his will, ensuring that I would inherit everything. He told me it was to set things right, but I never believed that was his true reason." Holmes leaned forward. "What do you believe, Mrs. Gray?" She hesitated, her hands gripping the bedsheets. "I believe he was being threatened." Arthur's voice wavered. "By whom?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "By whoever had kept Margaret Lyle's secret hidden for all these years. Someone who had far more to lose than Archibald did." Holmes turned to me with a triumphant glint in his eye. "Watson, we are no longer dealing with a simple inheritance dispute. This is a matter of deception, blackmail, and perhaps even murder." Arthur shook his head. "But who would go so far as to kill my aunt?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That, my dear Mr. Gray, is the very question I intend to answer. But first, I must confirm a suspicion." He strode to the door, pausing only to look back at Eleanor. "Mrs. Gray, tell me, where are these letters now?" Her face paled further. I hid them in my husband's study, inside the locked drawer of his desk. Holmes nodded, already reaching for his coat. Then, Watson, I believe our next destination is the late Mr. Gray's estate. I sighed, already anticipating the trouble ahead. And I suppose we are going there tonight? Holmes smirked. Of course. Time is of the essence, my dear fellow. The dead may rest, but their secrets do not. With that, he disappeared into the London night, leaving me no choice but to follow. Chapter 6. The carriage rattled along the cobblestone streets of London, its wheels echoing the urgency of our mission. Holmes, Watson, and a still distraught Arthur Gray approached the imposing facade of the late Mr. Archibald Gray's estate. Even in the dim glow of a London night, the mansion's austere architecture seemed to harbour secrets of its own, a silent witness to decades of whispered intrigues and hidden scandals. Upon entering the grand foyer, I could not help but notice the oppressive air of neglect mingled with latent opulence. Dust lay thick on the polished banisters and faded portraits, relics of a bygone era. Holmes's eyes scanned every detail with a mixture of detached curiosity and penetrating focus. "Mr. Gray," he began, "lead us to your uncle's study without delay. I am most interested in a particular locked drawer." Arthur's voice was hesitant as he led us up a sweeping staircase to a corridor lined with heavy oak doors. Finally, we reached a door marked Study. The wood was dark and polished, the brass knockers tarnished with time. Holmes examined the lock, his fingers dancing over the surface, his mind already calculating probabilities and permutations. "Do you recall, Mr. Gray, if your uncle ever mentioned peculiarities about this room?" Holmes inquired, his tone measured. Arthur hesitated before answering. He was a private man. I only ever heard him mutter about the study being his repository of secrets. I never imagined it would hide something so incriminating. Holmes's gaze hardened. "Secrets are the currency of deceit, Mr. Gray, and tonight we intend to collect our due." With a deft flick of his wrist, Holmes produced a slender set of lockpicks. I watched, both in admiration and mild apprehension, as he worked the lock with practised precision. In moments the mechanism yielded, and the drawer swung open to reveal its contents. There, nestled amid an assortment of mundane papers and ledgers, lay a bundle of neatly tied letters. Holmes carefully removed the bundle and began a quiet perusal, his eyes narrowing at the script. "These are the letters you mentioned, Mrs. Gray?" he asked, glancing at Arthur. "Indeed," Arthur replied, his voice trembling with a mix of anticipation and fear. "They were hidden away, almost as if my uncle wished to erase them from existence." Holmes unwrapped one of the letters, his keen eye noting the distinctive handwriting and the peculiar use of language. Traces of urgency and dread woven into the ink. "This," he murmured, "is a correspondence between Archibald Gray and a certain Margaret Lyle. But more than that, it speaks of a debt of silence, a promise to protect a secret that might ruin reputations and fortunes alike." Peered over his shoulder, noting how every word seemed to vibrate with unspoken implications. The letter hinted at blackmail, of clandestine meetings in secluded corners of London, and a looming threat that had driven Mrs. Gray into hiding. Holmes's mind was a whirlwind of connections, each piece of evidence every inflection of emotion in the script contributed to a broader mosaic of deception. Before Holmes could delve further, a sudden noise startled us. A soft creak, like that of a floorboard, under the weight of cautious steps. Holmes's eyes flashed, and he swiftly tucked the letters into his coat. "We are not alone," he whispered, his tone razor-sharp. Silence followed, broken only by the slow, deliberate tread of footsteps approaching the study. In an instant, Holmes signalled for us to hide behind the heavy draperies, his own figure merging with the darkened corner of the room. I felt my heart thumping in my ears as we waited, every sense alert to the slightest disturbance. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, his silhouette thin and angular against the pale light filtering through a stained-glass window. He moved, with an almost predatory grace, his eyes darting about as though expecting to encounter a trap at any moment. Holmes's presence, though hidden, was palpable, as if he were orchestrating every moment from within the darkness. The man paused at the desk, his gloved hand reaching out to peruse the very papers we had just examined. I could see his intense scrutiny as he rifled through drawers and documents, his movements calculated and deliberate. It was clear that he was searching for something, perhaps the same secret that had set this dangerous chain of events in motion. Exchanged a furtive glance with Holmes, who gave the slightest nod, a silent command that everything was proceeding as planned. Holmes's voice, low and commanding, broke the silence. "I must insist that you return to your duties, sir. You are not welcome here." The intruder startled, his eyes widening, as he realized he had been detected. In a moment of chaos, he attempted to make his escape, darting towards a side door. Holmes was upon him in an instant, his hand clamping over the man's wrist with a grip that conveyed both strength and certainty. "Who are you?" Holmes demanded, his tone icy with authority. The man, now visibly trembling, stuttered, I'm but a messenger, sent by a benefactor." Holmes's eyes narrowed dangerously. "A benefactor, you say? And what message were you entrusted with delivering?" Before the man could reply, Arthur, emboldened by the confrontation, stepped forward. "What is it that you know about the Grey family's secrets?" he demanded, his voice echoing with desperation and fear. The intruder's facade crumbled. "I have been hired to retrieve those letters," he confessed in a hurried whisper. "There is someone very powerful who wishes to see them destroyed. Someone who stands to lose everything if the truth about Margaret Lyle and Archibald Grey is revealed." Holmes's grip tightened, his mind racing through possibilities. "And who might this powerful individual be?" he pressed. The man's eyes darted around, his resolve crumbling under the weight of Holmes's scrutiny. "I cannot say, but I have seen shadows in high places, gentlemen. Shadows that move in corridors of power where even a whisper can topple empires." Holmes released the man, allowing him a moment to slump against the wall before motioning for us to follow him out of the study. "This man is our first tangible link to the conspiracies that have plagued the Grey family," Holmes declared, as we escorted the trembling messenger out of the estate. "We must not delay. The letters, the hidden correspondence, and this meeting all point to a force far greater than mere familial discord." As we stepped back into the cool night air, I could not help but feel that every clue we uncovered led us deeper into a labyrinth of treachery. Holmes's mind was already several steps ahead, piecing together the fragments of evidence with the precision of a master chess player. His eyes, glinting in the moonlight, promised that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would soon emerge from the shadows. Chapter 7. The cold London air greeted us as we stepped out of Gray's estate, the night thick with a pressing fog that curled around the gas lamps like a living thing. Holmes strode ahead, his sharp gaze flickering between the empty street corners and the rooftops above. The nervous messenger, whom Holmes had cornered just minutes ago, stumbled beside us, his hands trembling as he clutched his coat close. I could see the sheen of sweat forming at his temple despite the chill. He was afraid, not just of us, but of whoever had sent him. "You have one more chance to tell us the truth," Holmes said smoothly as he pulled the man aside. "Who hired you?" The man shook his head violently. "I cannot say." Holmes sighed. "Watson, kindly take note. A man who cannot say is often one who is terrified of saying." The messenger swallowed hard, but remained silent. Holmes tilted his head, studying him as one might a rare insect. Then, in a voice so casual it sent a chill through me, he murmured, "You see, my friend, I make it a rule never to press a man too hard when his life is in immediate danger. But if you wish to survive the night, I strongly suggest you begin cooperating." The messenger's breath hitched. He glanced around wildly, as if expecting something or someone to appear from the fog. His lips parted, but before he could speak, a sharp whistle cut through the silence. Holmes reacted instantly. "Down!" he barked. A gunshot rang out. The messenger gasped, his body jerking as a dark stain bloomed across his chest. With a strangled groan, he staggered forward, collapsing into my arms. "Watson!" Holmes was already in motion, his revolver drawn as he scanned the rooftops. I lowered the dying man to the pavement, pressing my hand to the wound, but I knew in an instant it was futile. His eyes were already losing focus. He tried to speak, his lips forming silent words. I leaned in. "Who did this? Tell us." A gurgling breath, a final shudder, then nothing. He was gone. Arthur Gray let out a strangled sound. "My God, they killed him, just like that." Holmes holstered his revolver with a sharp motion. "A warning," he muttered, "and a rather well-executed one at that." I tore a strip from my coat, covering the dead man's face. "Whoever we are up against, Holmes, they are willing to kill to keep their secret." Holmes was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the rooftops and alleyways with an expression I had come to recognize, a dangerous glint of pure calculation. Finally, he turned on his heel. "Come, Watson, we must return to Baker Street immediately." Arthur hesitated. But what about him? "We must inform the police." Holmes's voice was sharp. "And tell them what? That a nameless informant was murdered by an unseen assassin? Scotland Yard will only clutter the scene with their incompetence. We need information, and we need it before our enemies realize how much we already know." I understood. We were no longer investigating a mere inheritance dispute. This was a war of secrets, and the enemy had just fired the first true shot. As we climbed into the carriage, Holmes leaned closer to me, his voice low and urgent. "Watson, tonight we were meant to recover those letters. Instead, someone else made their move first. That tells me one thing." I met his gaze. "And what is that, Holmes?" He smiled grimly. "We are getting dangerously close to the truth." Chapter 8. A Trail of Shadows. We returned to Baker Street in silence, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily upon us. Holmes had barely spoken since the murder of the messenger, his mind lost in a labyrinth of deductions. Arthur Gray sat pale and shaken, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. As we entered the familiar warmth of our sitting room, Mrs. Hudson gave a start at the sight of our grim expressions. "Good heavens, Mr. Holmes, what's happened?" "A man has been murdered, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said briskly, shrugging off his coat. "And unless I am very much mistaken, it is only the beginning." Her hand flew to her mouth, but Holmes was already striding toward the desk, where he had carefully placed the bundle of letters retrieved from Gray's estate. With an almost surgical precision, he untied the ribbon and spread them across the table. I moved to stand beside him. "What are you looking for, Holmes?" "Patterns, Watson. Deceptions. Every crime has a thread, and it is our task to follow it to its source." His fingers skimmed over the delicate pages, his eyes flicking from letter to letter. Then suddenly he stopped. "This," he murmured, lifting one particular sheet. Arthur Gray leaned forward. "What is it?" Holmes tapped the parchment. "This letter differs from the others. Note the handwriting, it is the same, and yet there is a hesitation in the strokes. A forgery? No. An attempt to mimic something that was once natural, but has since become strained." He turned the letter toward me, pointing to a single line of text. "You must destroy all correspondence, Archibald. If the truth is known, it will ruin us both." Holmes looked up, his expression sharpened by intrigue. "Whoever wrote this feared exposure. That much is obvious. But consider, Watson, why would Margaret Lyle suddenly demand that Archibald Gray burn their letters? After years of secrecy, why did the threat suddenly become urgent?" Arthur frowned. Perhaps someone else had discovered the truth. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely, and I would wager that someone was none other than Eleanor Gray." Arthur's face twisted in horror. "Then, are you saying my uncle was killed because of this secret?" Holmes's gaze darkened. "It is a distinct possibility. If Margaret Lyle was indeed alive, and someone else sought to profit from her existence, blackmail would have been inevitable. And when secrets become liabilities, murder is often the next logical step." A sudden knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Holmes straightened, his entire frame tense. "Watson, if you would." I moved to the door and opened it cautiously. A young boy stood on the threshold, shivering in the cold. He was one of Holmes's street informants, one of the Baker Street irregulars. "Got a message for Mr. Holmes," the boy muttered, holding out a folded scrap of paper. Holmes took it, his sharp eyes scanning the contents in a single sweeping glance. A slow smile played at the corners of his lips. "Well, well," he murmured. "It appears our mystery has deepened yet again." I stepped forward. "What does it say?" Holmes handed me the note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet the message was chilling in its simplicity. "You are looking in the wrong places, Mr. Holmes. If you value your life, leave this case alone." Arthur gasped. "They're threatening you." Holmes chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. On the contrary, Mr. Gray, they are challenging me, and I never ignore a challenge." He turned toward me, his expression alight with excitement. "Watson, I believe it is time we paid a visit to Dr. Edwin Talbot, the man who declared Eleanor Gray dead." Chapter 9. The doctor's deception the following morning found us outside the well-appointed residence of Dr. Edwin Talbot, the physician, who had signed Eleanor Gray's death certificate. The house, a stately brick structure on Harley Street, was the very picture of Victorian professionalism, neat, respectable, and utterly unassuming. Holmes rapped sharply on the door. After a brief wait, a maid answered, her gaze flicking between us with curiosity. "My master does not usually receive visitors without prior appointment," she informed us with a slight frown. Holmes offered her a pleasant smile, but his words were firm. "Inform Dr. Talbot that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson require an immediate consultation. I trust he will not wish to delay." The mention of Holmes's name had the desired effect. The maid's face paled, and she scurried inside without another word. Moments later, we were ushered into the doctor's study, a richly furnished room, lined with medical texts and the scent of old parchment. Dr. Edwin Talbot himself stood by the fireplace, a tall, thin man with a neatly trimmed beard and an expression of forced politeness. He gestured for us to sit, though his eyes never left Holmes. "This is highly irregular," he said coolly. "What pressing matter brings you to my home, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes ignored the chair offered to him, choosing instead to pace leisurely before the desk. "Dr. Talbot, I trust you recall a certain Mrs. Eleanor Gray." The doctor's face remained composed, but I noted the brief flicker of tension in his jaw. "Of course, a tragic case." "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "One made all the more tragic by the fact that Mrs. Gray is very much alive." A long silence followed. The doctor's fingers twitched as he exhaled slowly. "That is quite impossible." Holmes's lips curled into a smirk. "And yet, here we are. You signed her death certificate, did you not?" Talbot's throat bobbed. "Yes. The body was examined. Her pulse had ceased. She displayed all the signs of death. I had no reason to suspect otherwise." "Curious," Holmes mused. "Tell me, Doctor, who else was present when you made this examination?" "Only her solicitor, Mr. Hargreaves. The servants were dismissed to provide privacy." Holmes nodded. "And where was the body found?" "In her home, slumped in a chair." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "And you detected no signs of foul play?" The doctor hesitated. "No." Holmes abruptly turned to me. "Watson, if you were called to verify a death, what would you check first?" I answered automatically. "The pulse, the pupils, the temperature of the body. Basic confirmation before making a declaration." Holmes turned back to Talbot. "And yet you did not wait for rigor mortis to set in, nor did you request a second opinion." Talbot's expression darkened. "I am an experienced physician, Mr. Holmes. I hardly require instruction on my profession." Holmes smiled. "No, of course not. But tell me, Doctor, who instructed you to declare her dead?" Talbot flinched ever so slightly. "No one." Holmes tapped his fingers against the desk. "I believe, Doctor, that you either made a grave error or were compelled to make a false declaration." He took a step closer, and I intend to find out which. The room grew unbearably tense. Talbot's hand clenched the armrest of his chair. I have nothing more to say on the matter. Holmes tilted his head. A pity. Then we shall have to ask Mr. Hargreaves instead. Talbot's expression shifted instantly. Hargreaves? Holmes smiled. Yes, he was present, was he not? I am certain he will be more forthcoming. The doctor hesitated, then sighed heavily. He reached for a glass of brandy on his desk and took a slow sip before speaking. I did what I was told, Mr. Holmes. Arthur Gray stiffened. Told by whom? Talbot exhaled through his nose, eyes darting to the door as if contemplating escape. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he spoke. The solicitor. Hargreaves came to me the night before. He told me that Eleanor Gray would be dead by morning, and that I was to confirm it. A cold shiver ran down my spine. You mean you signed a death certificate for a woman who was still alive? Talbot swallowed. I had no choice. Holmes's voice was like a blade. There is always a choice, Doctor. Talbot's hands trembled as he set down his glass. You don't understand, Mr. Holmes. Hargreaves is not merely a solicitor. He is a man with powerful connections. He made it very clear that if I refused, I would regret it. Arthur Gray's voice was barely above a whisper. Then Hargreaves knew my aunt was alive and tried to bury her anyway. Holmes turned sharply to us. Gentlemen, I believe it is time we paid a visit to Mr. Hargreaves. But before we could move, a crash came from the window. Glass shattered as a small object hurtled into the room. Holmes reacted instantly, grabbing the object, a small brass cylinder. Without hesitation, he threw it toward the fireplace. The moment it struck the flames, a thick billow of smoke erupted, filling the study with a choking, acrid fog. Gas! I coughed, pulling my handkerchief to my nose. Holmes seized my arm, dragging me toward the door. We are expected, Watson. Move, quickly! Through the swirling smoke, I could barely make out a shadowy figure outside the window, disappearing into the night. We stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. Behind us, Dr. Talbot collapsed to his knees, coughing violently. Holmes, ever unfazed, straightened his coat. His voice was eerily calm. Watson, Arthur, our enemies know we are close. Arthur still looked shaken. They just tried to kill us. Holmes gave a thin, sharp smile. Yes, and that means we are precisely where we need to be. He turned, on his heel. To Hargreaves, gentlemen, I believe we are about to uncover the final piece of this mystery. Chapter 10. The Vanishing Widow Unmasked. The carriage ride to the offices of Mr. Albert Hargreaves, solicitor to the late Archibald Gray, was marked by tense silence. Holmes sat in deep contemplation, his fingers drumming against his knee, his mind racing ahead of us all. Arthur Gray, still shaken by the gas attack at Dr. Talbot's house, muttered, Hargreaves planned all of this, didn't he? He tried to kill my aunt, twice. Holmes exhaled sharply. Hargreaves is certainly at the centre of it, but I suspect he is not working alone. I frowned. Then who else? Holmes's smile was thin and knowing. That, my dear Watson, is what we shall soon confirm. We arrived at Hargreaves & Co. solicitors. a grand but impersonal building nestled among the offices of London's elite. The brass plaque beside the door gleamed in the dim morning light. Holmes wasted no time, striding inside as though he owned the place. A nervous-looking clerk attempted to intercept us. "Mr. Hargreaves is unavailable." Holmes did not slow. "Then we shall make him available." Ignoring the protests, he pushed open the heavy door to the solicitor's office. Inside, Albert Hargreaves, a stout, balding man with a hawk-like nose, rose from his desk, his expression darkening. "Gideon, is the meaning of this intrusion?" he demanded. Holmes smiled. "Ah, Mr. Hargreaves, forgive the abrupt entry, but you see, we have quite the conundrum." He strolled forward, his hands behind his back. "A woman declared dead, a fraudulent inheritance, a missing fortune, and you, sir, sitting at the very heart of it." Hargreaves's mouth twitched. "I do not know what you are talking about." Holmes chuckled. "Come now, you arranged the false death of Eleanor Gray, ensured a closed-casket funeral, and nearly succeeded in silencing her forever." He glanced at Arthur. "Would you care to enlighten your nephew as to why?" Arthur stiffened. "You knew my aunt was alive?" Hargreaves exhaled through his nose. "If she was, it was none of my concern. My duty was to execute the will." Holmes raised a brow. "Indeed. And yet, curiously, you advised Dr. Talbot to confirm Mrs. Gray's death before she had actually expired." Hargreaves' face turned an ugly shade of red. "I did no such thing." Holmes sighed theatrically. "Really, Mr. Hargreaves, we mustn't waste each other's time. Let me tell you precisely what happened." He turned, pacing slowly. Archibald Gray, as we now know, had a secret. A living first wife, Margaret Lisle. This was a fact he wished to keep buried, but Eleanor Gray discovered it. That alone was not cause for alarm, until someone else saw an opportunity. Hargreaves' fingers clenched the edge of his desk. Holmes continued, his voice smooth and relentless. Margaret Lisle was presumed dead for decades, but in truth, she had been kept hidden by someone who profited from it. Arthur's face paled. "You mean—" Holmes smiled thinly. "Yes, Mr. Hargreaves." The solicitor's breath hitched. Holmes's voice sharpened. "You, sir, were the one who arranged Margaret Lisle's disappearance in the first place. You convinced Archibald Gray that his first wife had perished, allowing him to remarry. You controlled the legalities, ensuring that the estate remained clean. But when Eleanor Gray began asking questions, you realized your careful deception was crumbling." Hargreaves licked his lips. "You have no proof?" Holmes smirked. "No? Then allow me to present Exhibit A. The forged letters." From his coat, he produced the bundle of correspondence we had recovered. The desperate attempts to cover up the past, the sudden urgency to destroy all records, this was not Archibald Gray's fear, but yours. You knew that if the truth came to light, Eleanor Gray would contest the will, and worse, the law would discover your decades-long fraud. Arthur's voice was ice-cold. "You stole my uncle's fortune. And when my aunt refused to disappear, you tried to kill her." Hargreaves' mask finally cracked. His hands balled into fists, his breath coming fast. "You cannot prove," Holmes cut him off. The messenger you sent to retrieve the letters. He is dead, Mr. Hargreaves. The assassin's bullet was not meant for him. It was a warning to us. And as for proof—" Holmes smiled. "A simple visit to your financial records will confirm how much you have profited from this inheritance scandal." Hargreaves' face turned ghostly white. Holmes turned to Arthur. "Your aunt was never supposed to survive. First, they drugged her, ensuring she appeared lifeless. Then, they arranged a swift funeral, hiding the fact that she was alive. But when she miraculously escaped, they tried again, this time with a bullet." Arthur clenched his jaw. "You will answer for this, Hargreaves." But before he could move, Holmes raised a hand. "Not just yet, my dear fellow, because there is one last piece to the puzzle." Hargreaves stiffened. "What more could you possibly deduce?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Simple. You did not act alone." Silence fell. Holmes tilted his head. "You are clever, Mr. Hargreaves, but you are not a killer. No, the assassin, our unseen enemy, belongs to someone else, someone with even more to lose." I inhaled sharply. "Then who?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Margaret Lyle." Arthur gasped. "You mean she's alive?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed, and more than that, she has been protecting her secret from the very beginning." Hargreaves let out a breathless chuckle. "You'll never find her." Holmes smirked. "Oh, but I already have. It is remarkable how easy it is to track a ghost when one knows where to look." At that moment, the door burst open. Inspector Lestrade strode in, flanked by 2 constables. Holmes turned with a pleased expression. "Ah, Lestrade, excellent timing. Arrest Mr. Hargreaves for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder." The solicitor paled as the constables moved forward. "You have no idea what you're doing." Holmes's smirk deepened. "On the contrary, Mr. Hargreaves, I never act without certainty." As the officers took him away, Arthur Gray exhaled, shakily. "And what of Margaret Lyle?" Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "If my deductions are correct, she will attempt one last desperate escape." His gaze sharpened. "And I intend to be waiting for her." He turned to me with a triumphant gleam in his eye. "Come, Watson, the final act of this drama is about to unfold." I sighed, already knowing sleep would not be in my future. Epilogue: The Widow's Final Gambit. 2 nights after Albert Hargreaves' arrest, Holmes and I found ourselves at the London docks, shrouded in mist and the scent of salt and industry. The Thames lapped against the wooden piers, reflecting the dim glow of distant lanterns. Holmes stood motionless beside a stack of shipping crates, his breath steady, his eyes locked on the gangplank of the SS Cambria, a steamship bound for France. "She will come," he murmured. I exhaled, my revolver resting lightly in my palm. "Holmes, we are tracking a woman believed to be dead for decades. Are you certain she—" I stopped mid-sentence. A lone figure in a dark hooded cloak moved toward the ship, her steps quick, purposeful. Holmes's lips curled. "Margaret Lyle," he whispered. The woman reached the gangplank, producing a ticket from beneath her cloak. The ship's attendant barely glanced at her as she stepped forward, until Holmes's voice rang out, "Ah, Mrs. Lyle, I do hope you are not leaving in such a hurry." She froze. Slowly she turned, her face partially obscured by the hood. A pair of cold, calculating eyes met Holmes. "I don't know that name," she said quietly. Holmes stepped forward. "You have been dead for 30 years, madam. I should think that makes you rather difficult to forget." Margaret's lips tightened. "What do you want, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes smiled. "Justice, naturally." Her fingers twitched beneath her cloak. I tensed, anticipating a hidden weapon. Holmes raised a hand. "Do not be foolish. There is only one way this ends." Margaret's breath came faster, but her gaze remained fierce. "You cannot prove anything." Holmes sighed. "My dear lady, you faked your own death, allowed your husband to remarry, and then lived in secret while collecting money through Hargreaves. It was an excellent scheme until Eleanor Gray discovered the truth." Margaret's hands clenched. She should have stayed silent. Holmes smirked. "Indeed, and when she refused, Hargreaves had no choice but to remove her. But then she survived, and you, Mrs. Lyle, you were the one who ordered the second attempt on her life." Margaret's eyes flickered. For the first time, there was uncertainty in them. Holmes stepped closer. "Your biggest mistake was underestimating Eleanor Gray. She outlived your plot. She exposed Hargreaves, and now she is alive to testify against you." Margaret took a sharp breath. Then, without warning, she turned and ran. Holmes was after her in an instant. She sprinted along the dock, her cloak billowing as she darted between crates and barrels. But Holmes was faster. He anticipated her path, cutting her off at the next pier. She skidded to a halt, looking wildly between Holmes and the dark waters of the Thames below. Her breath came in ragged gasps. "I will not be taken." Holmes's voice was quiet but firm. "Surrender, Mrs. Lyle. The law is patient. The Thames is not." For a long moment she teetered on the edge. I saw the calculation in her eyes. Prison or the river? Finally, she raised her hands. Holmes let out a slow breath. A wise decision. Minutes later, Inspector Lestrade arrived with 2 constables, placing Margaret Lyle under arrest. Holmes watched silently as they led her away, his expression unreadable. We exhaled. "It's over," Holmes nodded. "Yes, Watson, but the past has a way of catching up, does it not?" Final reflections. Eleanor Gray recovered from her wounds and reclaimed her rightful inheritance. Albert Hargreaves and Margaret Lyle were both convicted. Hargreaves for fraud and conspiracy, Margaret for attempted murder. As for Holmes, he merely returned to Baker Street, lighting his pipe as if nothing had happened. "Well, Watson," he said with a smirk, "what did I tell you?" I sighed, shaking my head. "That the dead do not always stay buried?" He chuckled. "Precisely." And with that, he returned to the case files on his desk, already awaiting the next great mystery.